All right, well, thank you so much for having me, and I'm really sorry I couldn't be there in person. Hopefully another time that will work out, but my name is Nicole Salomons. Thank you for the introduction. I'm assistant professor at Imperial, and my area of research is human-robot interaction. So I'll be going through a couple of projects on the higher level that I've done over the past few years, and then I'll focus kind of the middle part of my talk on one specific project that is really focused on user modeling. And I'll explain also how that relates to human-robot interaction. So what even is human-robot interaction? So I always like to have at least one person interacting with a robot. The robot is there to understand the person and hopefully to guide them or help them in the best way possible. So a lot of my work, for example, has been done in robotic tutoring, where we have a social robot, like the one maybe on the right, or maybe an armed robot, like the one on the left, understanding the people around them, modeling their skills, and then providing personalized feedback. So like I mentioned, I like to really create a model of the people around the robot, understanding their skills, their preferences, their current states, their opinions. I often also incorporate the state of the world. What is the task they're doing? What is their objective? And when I will use a personalized model to create action selection mechanisms for the robot to optimize a certain parameter. And that can be optimizing the amount of learning the student does. It can optimize for the speed of the task, and so forth. But the big thing for me is I don't like to keep my robots constrained to lab worlds or these very constrained lab settings. Ideally, I would like to bring them into the real world. So instead of having a robot or social robot that's interacting with people in a very constrained control setting, my ultimate goal is to really bring these kind of social robots into the workplace or into real homes, which can often be a lot messier, more complicated. You might be dealing with multiple people at once. So how do we bring these robots from constrained environments to the real world? Because that's where they'll be in the long run, truly helping people. So I investigate how to build robotic systems that can tutor people or in general help people in complex and dynamic environments. But okay, if you look at a lot of my robots, you will see that they look like this. So we have a key pawn on the top left. Next to it, we have a Misty robot. On the bottom left, we have these small little vector robots and a forklift. And on the right, we have a Jiva robot. And what you might notice is that none of these robots, or few of these robots, actually have functioning arms. So are these robots still really learning? And my answer is yes, because they need to be interacting and understanding the people around them. They need to learn about the world, and usually they really need to learn a lot about the user itself. They need to understand when the user is coming close, what the user is saying. How do I optimize when the robot responds in return? So I'll be going through some more examples later on. So the robot needs to learn the user state, preferences, what kind of tasks has the user completed and what's left to do, the user's relationship to the robot, or maybe the user's relationship to people around them, their skills and what they're saying and things like that. So here are a couple of examples of prior work that I've done with a social robot, but that it is creating these intricate models of the user around them. So this is a robot that is a study I conducted around 4 years ago, where we have this simple social robot that we placed in the homes of 12 adults, or 24 adults. And the robot was there to observe while the person exercised, detect when they were making any sort of mistake during the exercise, and then provide personalized feedback. So the robot really needed to have kind of camera system on them, understand what the user was doing, what type of exercise they were doing when they completed a rep, and then taking that rep and detecting whether there was a mistake that occurred. And the main objective of this study was to see whether, does it even matter if you have a robot present? Can this just be done by an app on your phone or something like that? And throughout this study, we actually showed that having a physical robot present versus potentially the exact same robot but on a computer screen, that people learn more, they engage more, They feel guilty if they accidentally miss an exercise. So there is a value of having the physical robot present. A second study where we brought real robots into the homes of users. This was a robotic study where we brought these Jiba robots into the homes of people with autism spectrum disorder. So the robot provided daily therapy for the child with autism and their caregiver, which was usually one of their parents, every day for 30 minutes for a whole month. And the reason we're doing this is that there's something special about a way a robot can interact with a child with autism. They often stay longer engaged and they're more interested in doing therapy compared to an adult. So this study was the first one where we did a long-term test to see whether this type of robot could improve the social skills of children with autism in only a month of therapy. And we did see that. We saw that this robot was able to increase the social skills of these children in just a month. But they also needed to do a lot of learning about the child to do that. They needed to understand, where was the child looking at? Were they looking at the parent? Were they looking at the screen? We needed to model how the child progressed through the different therapy activities. So we needed to model the difficulty, whether we needed to increase it or decrease it, what types of activities they enjoyed the most. So we really needed to understand the child and also a little bit about the parent to make this system truly effective. I currently have a student who is focusing on multi-user interactions. So it's very common for social robots to interact one-to-one with the people around them. But that's not how we spend most of our time, right? We're often interacting with multiple people around them, holding conversations. The robot similarly needs to be able to model every single person around them, understand their different skills, understand what each person is saying. And then they need to optimize over multiple groups or multiple people within the group. So yeah, my student is currently looking at how do we have a robot that is understanding the skills of each individual in the group, then optimizing for the group as a whole. Because if we only ever focus on, let's say, the child with the least amount of skills, then the other kids might be growing bored over time. So the robot really needs to interact, understand and interact with every single member in the group. Okay, so how do I start by solving these kind of problems where the robot is understanding the people around them? Well, in a lot of situations that are outside of human-robot interaction, we can just throw some deep learning algorithms at them. But this often doesn't work that well in my domain. We do use them for sure, but often we just don't have enough data for the specific task or that specific group of people to fully use a deep learning algorithm. We could try to collect a lot of this data, but often that would be very, very tedious for participants. And we want those real natural interactions of the user. So frequently we use more traditional models, but also mix, of course, with some deep learning models. So later on, I'll show you one of the traditional models that I've been using throughout my experiments. Before I jump in, I really like this table that kind of shows the different types of Markov models. I use a lot of these different types in my studies, but I believe probably most of you guys will have seen Markov decision processes, which are very frequently used in reinforcement learning. Potentially, some of you guys might have seen partially observable Markov decision processes also used in RL. But I am going to focus a little bit more on the left-hand side, or namely on hidden Markov models. And the way this is organized is that in a robotic system, if you have control of the state transitions or the robot is acting upon the world, then they're either an MDP or a POMDP. And if the states are completely observable, then you're namely on those different two rows. Well, in our case, we are trying to model something about the people surrounding the robot. So we don't have full observability of the world. We can't understand the person's preferences, right? We could ask them, they might give us one small data point, but we often want to understand the user without consistently asking them lots of questions. So that's why I mainly live in this hidden Markov model world, but I also frequently want that the robot to optimize their actions for the person interacting with, and therefore go into the POMDP world too. Okay, so maybe some of you guys have already seen this, but I'm going to go through some of the basic definitions. A lot of this will look very similar to MDPs, or part of it, if you've looked into that recently. And from what I've heard, a lot of you might have taken an RL class where you've seen a lot of this. So similar to MDPs, we have states. And in this case, often the state is either the user or the task that they're interacting with the user. But let's think about this as the user. So we're trying to understand or model the user the robot is interacting with. The user might transition their state over time. They might learn something new. Their preferences might change. And we don't have full observability of the user, what state they're in. So we only get these hints of the user, which are represented by observations, or O. And for each, we have the probability of an observation given that the student is, or the person is in a particular state. So let's say I'm trying to decide, I have an ice cream giving robot. I'm trying to decide what flavor of ice cream I should give to the person who's in front of me. Well, the state is, what is their favorite ice cream flavor? And maybe I might not know that, right? So I need to look at what they're doing. So if they're staring at that mint chocolate chip, they keep on staring at the mint chocolate chip, that's an observation I'm getting from the world. And therefore, the robot maybe assumes that that's the ice cream flavor I want, and that's the first one it will suggest to the user. Over here, I also have a very, very simple example of this very simple world, and I'm trying to decide whether it is an appropriate time for a robot to interrupt the user. And let's say the robot is trying to decide when is an appropriate time for it to provide the news of the day, or to let them know that their meal is finished cooking. So let's say that this user has a very simple life where they spend some of their time asleep. After a while of being asleep, they might play a game for a while, and then they might read for a little bit, and then they'll work throughout the day, and at the end of the workday, they might read for a bit again before going back to sleep. So, of course, this is very simplistic, and real life people are not this simple, but in this world, how can we decide when is an appropriate time for the robot to step in and interrupt the user? We definitely don't want the robot interrupting them while they're asleep, right? That would be really annoying for a robot to wake you up and be like, hey, just to let you know, there's been another crash happening on the stock market. They probably also don't want to be interrupted throughout their working day on their computer. But if they're just playing a game or reading a book, maybe that is an appropriate time for the robot to step in and talk to the user. All right, but how do we know what state the user is in? We might only get hints of what they're currently doing. So let's have the simple world where if they're asleep, they're always lying down. So the symbol is lying down. They never sleep sitting up. They might have this observation when they're playing a computer game or a cell phone game, 30% of the time they're lying down in the bed on their phones, 70% of the time they're on their computer sat at the desk. Reading, most of the time they do lying down, sometimes they do sat at their desk, and working, 100% of the time they're sat at their desk. So those are all observations that we get from the user to see, to get some hint of what state they're truly in. We don't actually know whether they're working or not, or whether they're playing a game or reading. Okay, so let's say we know the very start state, that the user is currently playing game. Okay, that's fine. If we know the start state, we know that it's okay to interrupt. What about one time step later? Well, they'll be reading. And when they're reading, it's also okay, potentially, for the robot to interrupt. But what about 20 time steps later? We'll only get these observations, and through that, we need to make decisions. Yes, so if I want to, let's say, the probability of them being asleep while we observe that they're lying down, or the probability that they're reading while they're lying down, we can use Bayes' rule to avert this problem. So the probability of them playing game while they're lying down is the probability of them lying down while playing game times the probability of playing game divided by the total probability of lying down. So this is a simple way that we can invert the problem and know what is the most likely thing that they're currently doing, and then allow the robot to make decisions. And here's, if you ever want to go down through the math and try one of these examples, here it is, but I won't be going through that right now. Okay, so that was very much of a toy example with this very simplistic world, but let's apply this to a real problem. And we're going to apply this to the tutoring domain. So if you have a robotic system that is teaching a student how to perform a new task, or to learn a new language, or to learn some math, how can the robot know which skills they know and which skills they don't? So that's how we're going to use the hidden Markov model. And our observations are simply whether they're getting the answers right or wrong. So if they got an answer right, there's a higher likelihood that they'll know the problem at hand or the skill at hand. If they get the answer wrong, it's more likely that they don't. But of course, people sometimes guess correctly, or they might know the answer and got confused at one small step and they got the answer wrong. So one single observation is not often enough to have complete understanding of the student's skills. So our states in this case are whether the student has mastered the skill. So each skill will have its own state space. The transitions are the probability of going from a mastered, from a not mastered, this is incorrect, but it's going from a non-master state to a master state. So a student might have the opportunity to extend to learn a new skill, and therefore they go from not master to master that skill. And the observations we get are whether they got the answer right or wrong for each question. So yeah, here are more the definitions. So each skill has a probability of mastery, which we'll define as probability of L, or probability of the learner having mastered that skill. We'll have the prior knowledge estimate, and then we'll also have some helper probabilities. So we'll have the probability of guessing correctly. So if you think about a multiple choice question that has 4 options, if a person has no idea anything about that particular skill, but there's 4 options in a multiple choice question, what is the probability of them guessing correctly? 0.25, right? If they chose any answer at random, there's a 0.25% chance that they'll guess that correctly. We also need to define this probability of slipping. That is the probability that the student knows that skill, has mastered that skill, but then accidentally gets it wrong. And we all do this. Sometimes we know the answer, we've mastered that, but we accidentally do a sum wrong in our heads, and then get the answer wrong. Then lastly, we have the probability of transitioning, or the probability of going from not mastering a skill to having mastered a skill. So this is kind of how it is defined. So what's the probability that they will get the right answer? Let's say that the observation is 1. We see that the student has gotten a particular skill or that particular question right. What is the probability that they will get it right? Well, it is the probability that they have mastered that skill and that they have not slipped, so they've mastered it and not slipped, or that they've not mastered a skill but just guessed it correctly. Conversely, what is the probability that they'll get the answer wrong? So this is the opposite, right? So this is the probability that they have mastered a skill but accidentally just slipped and got it wrong, plus the probability that they've not mastered a skill and they have not guessed correctly. All right, so that's something that we'll need for later on, but now we want to start modeling whether the student has gotten their skills correctly or incorrectly. So given that a student got the right answer through a question, how should we update the probability of them knowing the skill? So what is the probability of mastery for a particular skill, given that we've seen that they got the answer correctly? So that's simply the probability that they know the skill divided by the probability that they got the answer correctly. And how do we know whether they know the skills? Well, if they knew the skill beforehand, times the probability that they didn't slip. divided by the probability of them getting the answer correctly in the first place. And this is all model, if you go side by side, this is all in a hidden Markov model format. We're also using Bayes' rule here to calculate these probabilities. How do we also, the opposite problem, how do we update the students' mastery of a particular skill, given that they got the wrong answer? Well, it's the probability of them having mastered that skill times the probability of them accidentally just slipping throughout that round, divided by the total probability of them getting the answer wrong. And then lastly, we have, we also want to model whether there's a chance that the student has learned or transitioned from a non-master state to a master state in the meanwhile. So it's a probability of them not knowing that skill beforehand and then transitioning to a state where they've learned the skill. This is all just in one page for reference. This might look like a lot of numbers, but if you think about it slowly, it's all quite simple and makes sense. It is simply the probabilities of you kind of knowing something and accidentally slipping, or you not knowing something and then guessing correctly. All right, and this is called Bayesian knowledge tracing, and it's very frequently used in tutoring systems. So if you have this automatic tutoring system, potentially even something like Duolingo will use something like this to model what skills you've likely learned, which skills you likely have not learned. And it works really well for simple tasks. So if I'm trying to model whether you know what multiplication is or addition is, this is when the Bayesian knowledge tracing works really well. But when a person is interacting with a robot, they don't have these very clean tasks, right? Often when a robot is teaching a person, maybe they're teaching a more complicated task, like how do you learn a new language? Or maybe they're in a collaborative setting where they're trying to build an IKEA desk together. And how does the robot know when the person doesn't know what kind of correct screw to put in? So real world problems are a lot more complicated than this. This is just repetition. So the limitations of Bayesian knowledge tracing are that there's often a single correct answer. Answers are frequently given through a user interface, and the system waits for the user to give the answer at the end of the task. But I want to work with real-life problems that are a lot more complex. So if a robot is interacting with a user, they might be doing something like building an electronic circuit. And as you clearly can see, this is a lot messier or more complicated to understand compared to a simple math problem. In this case, there's multiple possible answers. We don't have these very clean observations of correct or incorrect, right? We have these noise observations of a computer vision system that detects what the user is doing, when they're adding a piece, when they're moving a piece. And often it takes a user several minutes to complete a task like this. And if a robot is there to help, we don't want the robot to have to wait 3-4 minutes before stepping in. So that's why today I presented to you kind of an algorithm that I created several years ago called time-dependent Bayesian knowledge tracing, where we update Bayesian knowledge tracing to account for a lot of these more complex real-life tasks that robots might be interacting with real users in real environments. And we've updated the traditional Bayesian knowledge tracing algorithm to have these two new ideas. The first is that we model the user throughout task progression. We don't wait until the very end of the task where the user's gotten the answer completely correct or completely wrong, but we want to model and understand them in the meanwhile. So we have this attempted parameter where we model whether the user has given each skill a go or not, or what is the probability that they'll have given it a go over time. We also want opportunities for the system to intervene when it detects the user needs help with a skill. So we don't, again, wait until the very end. We keep track of the history of the user. We look at what they're doing over time, and using these sequences of observations, potentially every second or so, we observe what the user has done, and use that history to then detect whether a robot should step in and help the user in any way. I probably, due to time, will skip through the math and I'll go through the high-level ideas of this, but we can always go through this a little bit more in the discussion later on. But the attempted parameter considers the probability that the user will have attempted the skill given the amount of time that has passed. So if you take the circuit example, and that circuit example I showed earlier, it works exactly like a real electronic circuit. The main difference is that the pieces are nice and big and colorful, and that's really helpful because if you have a computer vision system, they're easy to detect pieces, easy to see what the user is doing. And so our main interest was not on the computer vision algorithm per se, but on the modeling the user, we decided to use those what we call snap circuits. Okay, but how do we know whether the user has attempted a particular skill? So there are certain skills that users will probably try really early on, right? So a simple skill like an LED, using an LED, it's more likely that they'll try that early on. Whereas closing a circuit, they'll have to have performed several different steps before they'll have a chance to give it a go or to attempt it. So the attempted parameter models the probability that they'll have given each skill a go. But once they've demonstrated that they tried the skill, we assume that they'll continue trying it over time. The other kind of change that we've made is this history. And this is simply that we average the past n observations. So we don't only wait till the end, but we average the past, I think, 10, 20 different time steps to see whether the user is continuously getting the answers right or wrong. And this means that very noisy observations have less of an impact on the mistakes that the system might made, because computer vision systems are never perfect, especially one where you have the user check in real time. We frequently observe that they have hands occluding the camera's view when they have the hands over the circuit. And it also means that using this history, that the user needs to consistently demonstrate the skill correctly for the robot to assume that they've mastered those particular skills. As always in research, we want to show that our algorithm works. So we compare it to the state of the art. Our main comparison was with traditional BKT, where the model is only updated at the very end. We also created this kind of variations of BKT, one where the model is updated every single time step using the current observation. But this, because due to noise, becomes very jumpy and can very quickly go one way or the other. And then we have the every time BKT, where the model is updated every time step using a prior belief. And then we have our model, which is continuous BKT. So over here, we can see the results. This is co-library divergence, which we use to detect the distance from the estimated skill state to the true user skill state. So how close am I to guessing what the user's true skill state is? And we see that our algorithm over time more quickly gets to the correct answer, and then it's significantly faster than other algorithms. But we don't just want to model the user skill state, right? We also want the robot to be able to act upon this. When it detects that the user has a low skill state, we want the robot to step in and provide some teaching on that task. So over here, we see that our algorithm also teaches the most new skills to users. It's somewhere not quite the optimal scenario, but it's close to that. It knows what is the ideal skill to teach the user given their observed skill state. We also implemented this on a real robotic system, where we had this UR5 robot that was teaching users how to build these tasks. So we had this overhead camera that was looking at the table and detecting what skills the user was implementing and whether they were correct or incorrect. We had all of these pieces on the table. And this showcases a real life example where a robot is interacting with the user. The observations are very noisy from this camera, and users are interesting. Whenever you perform a real experiment, they always do something unexpected. For example, we had one user that the whole 30 minutes of the interaction was continuously chatting with the robot, even though the robot never really said anything back. So that's always a fun side of doing human subject studies. And also in this real life skill, with this realistic scenario, we saw that people just learned more skills from the pre-test to the post-test when they had this model, this robot interacting with them, creating these real models, real life updated models of their skills throughout the interaction. The robot was able to correctly model their skills and then update that model and choose the correct skills to teach the user. Yeah, just so to conclude, our algorithm was able to model skills in complex tasks. It modeled user skills more correctly and quickly compared to other baselines, and it knew which were the optimal skills to teach once it had created that model of the user. All right, let me just see how I'm doing for time. I think I'm approaching the end, so I'm going to quickly go through some additional research that is maybe slightly different than what I presented here today, but just in case anybody is curious or wants to know a little bit more about it, feel free to send me an email chat with me at some point. So part of my work has also been done on not only modeling users, but understanding how robots can influence people. So we were interested in whether a group of very cute, simple robots, like the ones seen in the picture, and they're about 20 centimeters tall, 30 centimeters tall, so they're not very big. But can these robots cause people to conform to them or to change their answers? So we had this task where an additional robot would first give a clue, let's say give the word beauty, and then the user needed to select what answer or what figure best represented beauty on a tablet. And we were curious when the user knew that all three robots chose a different answer than them, would the user conform to the answers of the robots? And we saw that in about 30–40% of cases, people did change their answers based on the robots. This does not mean that we're about to have robots take over the world or anything like that. This is a simple, like, non-extreme task. When the robot did choose answers that were extremely wrong, participants tended not to go along with them. But it does potentially show the power that robots can have in marketing. They can provide suggestions and influence people's decisions. So unfortunately, this can be used for negative scenarios, but we're also hoping to maybe in the future see whether roboconformity can be used to motivate people to litter less, to concentrate more while studying, and things like that. This is an example where we took the previous conformity study and implemented it on these simple vector robots. And we were interested in seeing whether a group of robots could induce prosocial behavior. In this case, we had a person or an actor. The guy on the left is actually an actor, interact with real participants. And our actor, throughout the scenarios, would start getting mean or even abusive towards the robots. So whenever the little yellow robot made a mistake, their actor would start yelling at the robot and would build up to the time where they would pick up the robot and throw it across the table. Oh. And we were interested in seeing whether we could get participants to step in. And we noticed that just one simple behavior could influence participants to proactively step in and stop our actor. And that was by showing sadness towards the robotic abuse. Whenever the yellow robot was mistreated, the green and blue robot would immediately go, oh, like this very sad movement and noise towards the yellow robot. And we saw that just by doing that sad movement and noise, that people would step in and prevent the robotic abuse. So this is one case where it can be used for a good scenario. And full disclaimer, no robots were actually hurt in the making of the study. These robots are very robust, but it does show that robots can influence people's behaviors. And this is our current work where I have a PhD student, I actually have two PhD students that are looking at older adults. So I have one student who is looking at can we use social robots to connect older adults to other older adults? And in this case, we are really interested in modeling the social behaviors or social relationships in a care home. And can the robot suddenly encourage people to interact or engage more with each other? Loneliness is a big problem for some older adults. So really interested in seeing whether a robot can alleviate that situation. But we don't want these older adults to build these strong social connections with the robot. We really want the robot to encourage and blossom these relationships between the older adults themselves. And then the second, I have a second student who's looking at cognitive skill training. So specifically, can a social robot provide social skill training for people with dementia? And we are using this approved therapy that's actually, I think, developed by people at UCL in the psychology department, if I'm not mistaken. But it's called cognitive stimulation therapy. And we're interested in seeing whether this social robot, can they understand the user, model behaviors, chat with them on a daily basis, and improve their cognitive skills. So this therapy is very effective when conducted by humans, but we don't nearly have any number close enough of trained professionals to deliver this therapy. So we're interested in seeing whether we can build this in-home robotic system to provide therapy on a daily basis. So we are starting kind of large-scale trials this year, hopefully. We've done some shorter-term trials, and we're really hoping to see whether we can see some cognitive improvements in people with dementia. All right, that's all from me. I'm happy to have a discussion, or maybe let's start with some questions if there are any. And I can't see you guys. I might quickly go back here. I guess you probably can't see me only in the corner, but yeah.
Yeah.
Questions?
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the talk.